In this video, we'll discuss working a tubular cast-on for knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. The advantage of the cast-on is that it doesn't show very much at the bottom as a row of chain-stitched cast-on or E-wrapped cast-on stitches would. And it's not very difficult to do. Here it is.
We're working on a tubular cast-on for use on knitting looms and for 2x2 rib. That's 2 knit, 2 purl. Knit 2, purl 2. A lot of people like this sort of cast on because it does not create a line of stitches at the bottom. It's just pretty close to invisible. And it's fairly firm, but it still has a suitable amount of stretch. Here it is in a pink sample. I have a separate video for doing this on a kiss loom. So on this video, let's do it on these knitting board and Cindwood looms. The knitting board is the smaller gauge of the two, and we'll do that first. Here's how I've set up. First, a few rows of waste yarn in anything that will knit well on the loom. We just need something to hold on to. Then a single row of a separating yarn, also known as ravel cord. We will pull that out, so don't make any loops or knots in the ends of it. This will free our cast on from the main yarn, from the waste yarn, when the time comes. Also, I'm really going to make 14 stitches of knit 2, purl 2. So I cast on half that number plus 1, which is 8. And I should tell you there's some major construction going on at my house. So you're not hearing Armageddon, at least I don't think so. If it gets too loud, I'll shut down and finish later. But if you just hear a little tapping, don't panic. Now what I want to do is use U-wrap, but I don't make U-wrap exactly like everybody else. I let it sort of make itself automatically, simply by going up, over, and giving a pull. And that causes my main yarn, my pink yarn, to wrap all the way around the peg, just as if I had wrapped it with my hand. So we're going to do 3 rows like this, and then come back. I'll go off camera and finish the 3. I need to tell you 2 more things I just realized. This very first row of main yarn, it's quite important that it not be tight. If it is tight, you won't be able to properly lift the stitches that you need to lift later. Also, do not slip any of the end stitches. I'm going to do a half hitch there and come back. We need each one of them to be a complete stitch, where sometimes you would slip, but not for this project. Okay, 3 main yarn rows have been knitted. Now we're going to start with knit 2, and I'm making a half hitch for my very first stitch. The second one is normal. And now it's time to purl 2. But here's where things get different than usual. We'll move over these 2 knit stitches, and to create a purl stitch, or the place to start a purl stitch, we fish around in here and find the purl bumps. That's the second one on this row. The first one's a little harder to find, so I start with the second one and work back. And there it is trying to hide. This is why it was critical that that first row not be overly tight, because we now need to lift it up and onto the peg. Now we can purl into that stitch. There we go. We're going to do the same thing again. Move these over to make room for where we want the next purl stitch. Now you see, too, why it's so important that you use contrasting colors of yarn for your waste yarn. There's my next purl bump. Lift it, put it on the peg, and purl into it. Time for the next knit 2, and of course they're ordinary. knit, knit. Time to move over and make space. Now, technically speaking, you might wonder, why don't you move over 2 pegs at once and save a step? And you see why. It would be too tight, that's all. If you could, that would be fine. And possibly in some yarns you can. On my Kiss small gauge looms I can, because they're set up with the pegs oriented differently. But on this loom I haven't found it's workable. Okay, looking down inside, let me get that pink strand out of the way. It's kind of occluding your vision. There we go. I'm going to attempt to zoom this for you. That's what we want right there. Now I'm going to zoom back out to give you some perspective as soon as I hang this. Okay, we're ready to purl into the recently hung stitch. When I was learning this, what I was doing is trying to adapt hand knitting instructions. And I had a little conceptual problem beyond the basic ones, in that I kept thinking, but we started with waste yarn, and that means that our first row of stitches is an open batch of loops. What would keep them from unraveling? And actually, what's keeping them from unraveling is the hanging process. There are no loose or open or unrestrained loops after we hang, because the bottom of every stitch has been engaged in another stitch. Now this time, you notice I moved to the left. I have learned you could put all the stitches at the left and continually move rightwards or the other direction, but you will have to move more stitches if you do that by the time you get to the far end from where you started. So here is my next purl bump. It's here. We need to lift it and place it on the peg. This one is misbehaving. There we go. Sorry, I know my thumb got in the way. I had to get stern with it. Let me back this out a little. We'll purl. Knit 2 more stitches. Moving to the left now. If you decided for some reason that you wanted to move to the right, it wouldn't hurt anything. You'll end up with your stitches on different portions of the loom, but if you don't care, I don't care. Looking for a purl bump. These last couple are the toughest. There we go. The yarn tried to split, and it's very important that we not permit that. Hang it. And we'll purl into that stitch. Let's move over one more time. Before we go on, however, let's do some of this on a Cindwood loom. This is constructed just about the same, really, as the knitting board style. Look at all that mess. But this is a bulkier gauge, being a 5/8 inch loom, and I don't actually have the appropriate yarn, so we're just going to wing it. It's going to look looser. And because I really should be using bulkier yarn, I'm going to have to pay extra attention to keeping my first stitches loose enough. So, for that reason, and for variety, just so we can see it done both ways, I have E-wrapped these first main yarn rows. And I think that's possible to E-wrap these just to make it easier to stretch, but to switch to normal knit stitch or flat stitch or U-stitch, my usual favorite, thereafter. Just a thought. This time I'm on the left, half hitch, E-wrapped knit stitch, knit over. Now we need to make space. Move over, and locate the purl bump. This yellow is wonderful about displaying it. Here we go. There's number 1. Well, actually, it's not the yellow we want. It's what's next to the yellow there. All right, so we will purl that stitch. And we'll move over again so that we can purl a second stitch. That's the one we just made. Here's our working yarn loosening up, but it's no problem to tighten it. Now we reach down and look for the next purl bump. This is the very edge. That is not it. This is it. Purl this stitch. Okay, time for knit 2. And to move over and make room. Sorry, the camera moved. I am working behind the camera, trying not to bump it, but my chin got it as I peered around to try to find my stitches. Two more to move. My working yarn loosened up a little as usual, but that's no problem. There's our next purl bump. We'll bring it on over, and we will purl into it. Time to move things over and make room. And now, since we only have 3 stitches over here, let's move this direction. There's the next purl bump. Seeing down into the Cindwood loom is nice and easy, isn't it? Purl into it. Two knit stitches. Whoops, I almost did U-stitch. It's the one I use the very most, and that's just what my fingers think of doing if I don't tell them. I think I just spotted a miscount on my part, but we're going to keep going. I should have 2 stitches left here, and I only have 1. But for demonstration purposes, it's not a disaster. If this were a real project, you need to start over. I've made the room already for the next stitch, and this particular view shows up the next purl bump beautifully. Lift it up, find the working yarn, purl. And we need one more purl stitch. We need to move this over. There should be one more purl bump to work with. And there it is. And I must tell you that using E-wrap for this did make it easier to hang. I think it's also going to make a looser bottom edge, so we'll have to be aware of that possibility. I got my working yarn in the wrong place. I'm swapping it back. Now, purl. And we'll finish by knitting the last stitch, which, as I mentioned, should be 2 stitches. Actually, we'll go ahead and increase right here using a knit front and back technique. If I take the stitch I just knitted into, lift it up, twist it, and place it there, this is like knitting into the front and the back of a stitch to increase. Okay, now I'm going to knit 2, purl 2 around both of these till we have enough to look at. Here's the one we knitted on the knitting board loom. Let's find these little pieces of green yarn, the separating yarn, and try to pull them out. I've got a little bit of tangling right there, so I'm going to release that, and then I should just be able to pull. If not, we can snip it, but it worked. That's what's so cool about knitting in a row of ravel cord or separating yarn. I could have made my stitches a touch more even. I apologize for that. We're going to say that's because I was working around the camera. I'm not expecting this one made on the Cindwood loom to be as good looking. And it's not because of anything about Cindwood. It's because I used a yarn that was not really appropriate to the loom. But let's see what we do get. And here we go. Yeah, it looks ripplier. It's not as snug because I did start with the E-wrap and it is not the appropriate yarn. But it still makes an edge that doesn't have a specific edge. It doesn't have a chain at the bottom or a row of E-wraps. And it will certainly look considerably nicer when done with the appropriate yarn.